Hey yo, une vidéo de Riot sur Katarina. Qu'est-ce que c'est que ça?
Alright, here we go.
Ah, ça doit être sur le design. Leur super méga artistique. Est-ce qu'il y a sous-titres en français normalement? Oui, non. J'adore parce que YouTube, l'IA de YouTube traduit les titres en français, mais par contre on n'a pas... Bon, je vais quand même mettre les sous-titres en anglais. C'est pas grave, allez, let's go, c'est parti. Du coup, je pense que ça va être sur le design du perso. Ça devrait pas être sur un reveal de nouveaux persos, je pense pas.
Hi everyone, welcome to a super scary super art power hour. My name is
Ambiance
Night.
spooky
I'm
ou quoi?
character concept artist on 2XPO. And my role
J'en
is to
profiter
bring
pour
your
manger la
favorite
vidéo un
League
peu
of
longue.
Legends characters to the wonderful world of fighting games. So let's get started. I've been with the 2XK team since 2022, and the first champion I've got to work on that has actually come out is Vi. I was the character designer on Vi, so I designed her costume.
Ouais, je me
and the
disais que
general
c'était ses
way that she
dessins.
looks in
Elle
the
dessine
game,
trop bien.
and she was an absolute joy to work on, especially because the team that worked on her was so passionate about bringing our version of her to the screen to all of you. And more recently, Warwick, the uncaged wrath of Zon, has just joined the roster. I was honored again to be able to say that I was his character designer, bringing a new and fresh take on Warwick to 2XKO. I've also done a lot of
Ça tombe bien,
illustrations
c'est
for the
ce
game
que
as
je
well,
joue
so if you've ever
actuellement.
seen us at EVO, for any of our booth stuff at EVO as well. So today we're going to be bringing Katarina, the sinister blade, into 2XKO. We're going to be translating her from her original League design and bringing her into a little bit of this new environment. I'll start with a research pass, and then we will go into
c'est
a
déjà
phase
trop beau.
called exploration, where we'll just try to come up with as many different ideas as possible. From there, we do some level of refinement.
J'adore sa
that
façon de
might
dessiner
be
les
pulling
yeux.
her more into the style of 2X before finalizing her design ready
Ouah.
for the character art team to take that.
Je sais pas si ça va être ça son
along
design
through the production
final,
process.
mais
We're going
pas propre.
to talk about processes for designing a champ for 2XKO, why we make certain decisions. So hopefully by the end of this, we will be able to see a vision of who Katarina might be and what she might look like in 2XKO as a fighting game character. So normally that would take in itself about a week, and then the concepting process typically takes about 2 to 3 months, but we're gonna do all that in an hour. So let's figure out how that's gonna work out, but ultimately the process will still be the same, and we'll still get something at the end of it. Hopefully that will be a very fun and cool looking Katarina. And just to emphasize, this is not going to ship in-game. Katarina was originally part of a very early slice of 2XKO. At the time, 2XKO was still a 1v1 fighting game. Now, as a 2v2 tag fighter, Katarina just kind of proved to be too potent a champion, and so while we currently have no plans to put Katarina on our roster, if and when we do get to her, we hope that we can do her justice.
Pas
But
grave.
we are going to
Ça
focus
peut être
on
justement un
developing the version
personnage
of Katarina that we
qui peut être
probably
cool en
wouldn't ship in
jouant
game. Since it is the
juggernaut,
season of
du coup.
Halloween, we will be endeavoring to make a Katarina that is just a little bit darker than what you might
Si c'est un
expect her to be.
personnage qui est
Since she
plus
is the
pour
Sinister Blade, we're just going to make sure that that is
être joué
very
seul.
obvious. The beginning of every concept process for any champ on 2XKO starts with research. Research is really important because as artists, we are always trying to operate from not only a place of non-bias, but also always trying to expand our understanding of where we could take champs in the future. How I choose reference is very much from a perspective of let's do what is expected and then let's try to find the unexpected element. Even though a champ might have certain obvious wins that we could definitely, lean into. Katarina is essentially an assassin, keeping her light and agile. When it comes to building reference and research, it's about expanding that understanding by trying to ask questions about how can we make these characters feel evolved in their canon. So for Katarina, when I'm building out her mood board. Her mood board is very much focused on kind of expanding the material reads that she already has. I'm thinking a lot about what does she already have and also what does she not have. Noxus, which is the place that she comes from, the faction that she belongs to, has a very particular look and style to it already. So I want her to definitely feel still like a citizen of Noxus. So this research that I'm doing is predominantly fashion research. I think fashion is a very underutilized element of character design. Katarina has a lot of leathers, she's got the metal spikes. Noxus has all of your classic black toned leathers. Katarina has like a metal bracer with spikes on it. She's obviously got a very iconic red hair. And that kind of makes up the bulk of her different materials. All of those are elements that are relatively easy to work with, but I want to figure out how we can push Katarina away from just being what we know her to be. So we're going to see how this goes. We're going to see what we come up with. So let's get started. I think probably the first thing I'm going to do is chop all her hair off because that's the first thing I always try with long-haired characters, is just to see what they look like with like short hair, short bob. I don't know why, but we'll give it a try because no one gets to stop me today. So I'm gonna try it. So the main program that I personally use is Clip Studio Paint. Clip Studio Paint has a lot of like interesting gimmicks that I think serve concept pretty well. Riot uses Wacom Cintiqs. Cintiqs are definitely hard to beat once you've gotten used to them. The other tool that I use is Torbox. Torboxes are sort of a third-party tool which allow you to put any degree of keyboard shortcuts and key them to buttons and dials on the actual interface itself. Tools like the Torbox, for me, are really helpful because they help me streamline my entire workflow to just like one central piece of technology. And this little poop icon brush, some random person in the world made it, and I think basically everyone I know uses the little poop man. He saves lives. He saved my life. Everything about the way that I work is basically geared towards making sure that the least amount of resistance is between me and the act of drawing. We always want to take the path of least resistance for champs, because the reality is if we don't do it, you know, there's no one, you know, succeeding us in the process that's going to be able to make those big swings again. So as concept artists, our main role is to try to make as many large swings as possible, so that ultimately, if we do decide to go with something that looks very similar to base, it was because we had gone through this whole process to decide, you know, it worked better, it feels like it fits our game. I will always want to, you know, try and adapt and evolve a character than just do what came before. Partially because it's also just way more fun. it's way more enjoyable to do that for work. I'm a big proponent of, if we can change it, we should, just to see what it looks like, just to see if it makes the character feel fresh and exciting. I'm also, I think, a little bit of an irresponsible designer because I spend a lot of time thinking about things that kind of don't matter. I get really wrapped up in details early on in the process that help me understand who they are. That I think, classically, if you were trained to be a concept artist, you'd be told, like, early exploration should be quick and fast and don't feel too precious about stuff, and I do all that, but I also want to take my time to understand like who this character is and get to know them a bit more. You know, typically I'll have a couple months to do that process. I'll have a couple months to really talk to them and get to understand like what makes them tick, what issues they have, what tragedies happen to them, and how do they respond to those things. And so over the course of designing a character, I will get to know them in a way that feels personal, only because it allows me to make decisions kind of on their behalf. If you're going to approach a champ, you have to do it kind of like holistically on all sides. So know who they are in the canon, and then dare to ask them who they might want to be in the future. We generally have certain rules in regards to like what is possible and what is expensive. A lot of cloth on characters is a really expensive thing to add. Having really bulky things like capes are really expensive. I remember Darius was a huge thing. We were convinced that we'd never do another cape again, at least to save our animators a little bit more of their lifespan
Ah ouais, c'est si
from
chiant que
having
ça.
to do another cape character. So then our role is really to think about, like, here's all the ways that we can make this a less painful process. One of the things that I was really surprised by when I started working on characters for 2XKO was how much noise gets added by stuff you don't expect. So shadows and line work are part of our cell shading style. You need to have line work on most things that are important and can like communicate form, and you need to have shadows to do very much the same thing. But a combination of those two things is a killer. It's absolutely this like visual noise generating machine
tous les
to have
artistes que je suis
a
sur
combination
Instagram.
of too much line work and too many shadows and too many colors. It's surprising how easy it is to lose a character completely just by having, you know, a few too many details. So you kind of have to be willing to die on whatever hill your art creates. I've been shown many times that even a simple, boring design can be a nightmare in terms of noise, because there's that added value of movement and motion. There's the light shifting around. There's, you know, effects and all that. So it almost becomes a task too difficult to handle when
C'est vrai que
you
c'est
kind of just
disait,
full send every detail, full
au niveau
send
des
every
détails,
design, just
même en
say,
termes
well,
de
since
sound
it's,
design,
you know, not that
je trouve
complicated
le jeu
on the
vraiment
concept
très
sheet,
très
it shouldn't be
clean.
that bad. I've been surprised many times.
Et c'est la remarque que je m'étais fait quand j'ai joué à 2XKO à l'Evo Nice, c'est que le changement de personnage et même le sound design général du jeu n'était pas aussi clean que 2XKO. Genre les changements de personnage, genre dans 2XKO, il y a vraiment quand le tag, c'est ça, genre on l'entend. My time.
Assortment with his cowl was problematic for the longest time, and they managed to make it work, but it required a lot of very delicate kind of animation work and fine-tuning, which again, the cost of it is heavy. When we do it, we need to make sure that the cost of it is worth it. It creates a better design, it makes the character feel, you know, more fantastical and more aspirational, and that the character is not otherwise also expensive in other ways. Typically for fighting games, you want people to be able to track extremities, so their hands, the head, the feet, and you want them to be able to distinguish individual parts of the body. So you want them to be able to tell the head apart from the torso, arms apart from the body, legs and feet separate from each other and all that. Especially on a character like KATARINA, who has kind of predominantly black leather on her, areas of different tone, like her skin tone, actually ends up being a way to save that element for her. While they're tracking the opponent's movements, you don't want them to have the mental stack of also trying to figure out what the heck their character is doing on the other side. You know, even if they inputted something they think is right, you want to make sure everything's recognizable. So that's where animators will do their best to take the elements we've designed to create really strong key poses. We're constantly trying to make decisions that not only push our characters further than they were before, but at the same time emphasize their best parts, emphasize what makes them cool, and
c'est le seul perso
also
contre qui ça me
not
fait
make
ça,
it
genre
a terrible
Dromédario,
workout.
j'ai aucun
I
souci,
think
mais
the allure of a concept artist is that you get to be the ideas person, you get to be in the room with all of the people talking about the big aspirational thing. But games are a collaborative process, and we are part of a production. And I think when you don't consider who is going to have to make those parts of your ideas real, you sort of basically give up your part of the process. Because I could say, yeah, it'd be super great if every character had a million tassels and all of them had long hair and flowing capes, because I love fabric, I love drawing fabric, but to know that it would cost coworkers of mine many months of their life to make that happen, only for it to kind of have been not a big deal for all of that to have looked the way it did. It's an exchange I try to be very cognizant of, because games are expensive. People should be spending their time on stuff that really makes a difference, and so always trying to make choices based on how much of a difference we believe it makes for that character. Coming from being an illustrator, I think you have a lot of preconceived notions about, like, yeah, I know how to make good art, and therefore I know how to transition into a new space that also makes good art. But design is not about making good art. It's about making these functional vehicles for other things. To only ever treat a concept task as a desire to make a nice looking character that is just meant to be cool without ever considering like what it might do to the player experience, what it might do to the ease of the development of that design in particular. That was something I had to learn pretty quickly on this team, only because fighting games are so particular in clarity. While we want to make sure that our game stands separate and in a way that feels unique and new, you can't completely get rid of some of these like basic design philosophies, because what they did was allow people to get into fighting games. What it allowed them to do was to play these competitively and, not allow an intricately looking game to prevent them from playing it on a high technical level. We want to be a nice, flashy looking game, but we also want to be a game that people will not need to fight in order to understand and to play. Those are all things that we try to think about when designing. Is just like, what are we adding to or detracting from? Concept has a kind of responsibility to consider some of these things ahead of everyone else, because we have such this like early access look to what is going to end up being the scaffolding for everyone else's role. There's a lot of, I'd say, pressure, but I mean, it is just our job. It is the responsibility of concept art to take that seriously. So I think working on this team has really shown me what it means to take that seriously. Top-down League of Legends gets to kind of focus in on that like top half of the character and really build posing, attack animations, character design, color palettes off of that top-down read.
Oh, le poisson de mer là, j'ai oublié son nom, mais j'espère qu'il arrivera dans 15 ans. Hein.
A question people had about Vi when she came out was, why did we make these decisions? Why
que j'ai joué à
are
LoL,
certain parts of her flipped, and why do they not sit on the side that we expect them to on League of Legends? When players see a change in that, they react in a way of like, oh, so is this not canon? Is this like a totally different version of them, or is this just a totally different character? It's because the camera view is a pretty drastic change in your perception of who they are. We always design for player 1 or P1, so they are always starting on the left-hand screen and looking towards the right-hand screen. So what you see most often is usually the right-hand side of their body. When that happens, certain details become a little bit obfuscated. So Katarina's scar typically lives on the left eye, but if you don't get to see that side of her face very often, then this really core part of her visual identity starts to get lost. When it's such a fast game, when it's such a fast kind of a heavy motion type of environment, you want to give each of those really important character details a moment to shine. The best way to do that is to shift all of these different details, move them around, rearrange them. But the thing we try to keep in mind most is we're a fighting game first and a League of Legends game second. With that comes a responsibility to not only account for, this love and devotion that people have had to League of Legends, but also our commitment to making a really beautiful and modern fighting game. The reason why I flip back and forth, I think every artist has their own way of doing this, but it's essentially kind of forcing your brain to reframe, readjust, and reassess the thing that you're looking at. I flip really frequently. It's almost like walking into a different room while having a thought. It's like your brain just automatically switches in context. And so even though I've been looking at the same piece for a little bit of time, my brain registers that like sudden change in angle and in visual as like a whole new piece. And sometimes my eyes can catch onto something, sometimes they don't. But I like doing it, and at this point I do it pretty frequently just to keep refreshing the image in my mind, because I have a variety of personal like quirks and flaws that always catch me when I'm drawing. One of those things is I'm really bad at symmetry, so when I draw things tend to start to like slant, and they start to tip and are not parallel with each other. So when I flip stuff, it's super easy to see when one side of the face is like drastically different in height versus another part of the face, and vice versa. It's great for looking at values, checking proportion. So I do it frequently enough, at this point out of habit, but classically just because when you are constantly forcing your brain to reassess the piece, you just kind of get better context for where it is at the moment. And so at this point I do it perhaps a little too much, which is super great for me, not great for anyone who has to watch me draw. So sorry, but also highly recommend it as well if you don't flip your stuff. I know some people like rotate it. They rotate their canvas quite a bit to achieve the same effect, but rotating takes too long when I can just press a button. I'm always trying to think about silhouette, and I'm always trying to think about like sort of the proportion.
Ah ouais, ils viennent carrément différents avec le
in a
chocolat
fighting
et
game, characters are
la capuche.
constantly moving, so you don't even get the opportunity to really appreciate a lot of the finer details of a character, which we add to make them interesting, to make them look cool. But when they're, 99% of the time when you're watching a fighting game match, they are moving, they're jumping, they're flipping. Like, you don't get to see most of the details we put into a character. But what you do get to see is this sort of a little bit of that silhouette as they're, performing their key pose, as they're about to, if we ever like pause, really linger on a moment to make a certain hit feel stronger. Those are the things that you really see and internalize. So as I'm doing, early explorations, I am also thinking about easy places to add a little bit of extra, silhouette, a little bit of extra dynamic shape design. For example, like her gauntlets, it's easy to make just like a form-fitting plate that has like some thin spikes on it, but I want to chunk those spikes up because that makes it easier to see it on screen. Even if she's moving around a lot, you'll at least get to see this like kind of dramatic metal shape on her arm, which allows you to potentially track her arm during an animation. If I'm going to add details like that in, I want to make sure that they're impactful, that they make a difference for her character. Small things like rivets, buttons, belt buckles that like don't really enhance the silhouette, I'll usually either remove or really reduce in kind of notoriety in her general real estate of her design, because it helps us organize visual importance on a character. I'm just gonna be doing that across all of her different parts, pulling out edges, making them sharper, more dramatic. I always talk about fighting characters that they're larger than life, and everything on them is just this, like, it's double the size, they have double the muscle mass, they have double the personality. It's like this kind of leaping off the page, leaping out of the screen, kind of translation of a character. But I try different poses so that you can see a costume in motion, right? Body type is also something that we think about in this stage. I try a bunch of different body types, just like I try a bunch of different poses, which I think is counter to what a lot of concept artists are taught to do. I do it because it's fun, and I enjoy it. It is not conducive to easy viewing, but I have fun. So that's all that's important, I guess, to me. But I try different poses so that you can see a costume in motion, right? The main reason why I do it is because the classic concept art pose always has them facing 3/4 and is always in a very static, stiff kind of position so that you can see all the details clearly. But to me, what that does is rob a character of any kind of personality or individuality, and also certain clothes might not fit all personality types. So for KATARINA, I might try one that feels a little bit more hunched, a little bit more aggressive. I might try one that feels a little bit more solemn, a little bit more depressed in comparison to each other, and I wouldn't want to dress that character the same. Maybe it's an excuse. I think that the pose and the costume help each other tell a stronger story. Body type is also a way to tell that story as well. But in the context of everyone else in 2XKO who has also become slightly beefier, they all gotten into protein, she will feel appropriately thinner than the rest of them. But I can't resist adding a little bit more muscle than I think people expect. I like to keep as much of the character in flux while also still bringing in elements that I feel will add that back in. So if I do change the costume, I might keep the hair the same. When you get other people's interpretations or like perspectives on a character, you get a sense for like what the consensus is for what makes a character them. For Katarina, it could be her red hair for some people. It could be something very visual, right? I'm obviously going to keep the scar on her eye, although some people may not be excited about what I do with the scar on her eye. The red hair will probably stay red. I'm not going to do anything about that, although I do want to try cutting it short. And the costuming, because to me, I think the costume of Katarina does not
les pics sur les bras ou les épaulettes, j'ai pas
accessory to this holistic understanding of who she is. The very fact that we as humans often will choose different clothing every day, but that does not necessarily deviate from our identity, because we reasonably try to dress within the bounds of comfort and the bounds of what we expect for ourselves. Outside of certain circumstances, you can change your clothes and people will still recognize that it's you, either by your mannerism, by the way obviously your face probably stays the same. That being said, I'm a loose cannon as far as this is concerned. So I'm going to change absolutely everything and keep nothing precious. And then at the very end, we're going to decide what's definitely Katarina, what's definitely not.
C'est le côté mode en car design,
so I'm going to do that. If that affects how you see this character, then I think that speaks a lot to what you value.
Je savais que la vidéo allait être intéressante, mais je pense pas qu'elle allait être
autant. If you're an aspiring
autant.
character designer, it's a fantastic thing to know about yourself. The way that you yourself interpret how designs can be translated, how they can change and evolve, but then also what must stay the same. Those are personal quirks and personal philosophies that each character designer has. So for me, I might have a much more dramatic taste for change than someone else who might look at these characters and say, I have other solutions for how we can keep that consistent. But unfortunately, you're stuck with me. So we're gonna do this my way, which is essentially everything is up for grabs and on the table until proven otherwise. And now here's a problem. I don't know how to flip this, so I'm just gonna cheat.
Je sais pas comment le fait.
I don't know what it is.
C'est que elle arrive à autant parler en dessinant.
I can't flip
et elle va faire tout ça en 1 heure.
I can't copy things. I can't make things symmetrical. I can't tell left from right, which is not the kind of person I thought I was gonna grow up to be, but turns out I can't. So there's certain things like, oh, can I redraw this sword again? Turns out I can't. So I'm just gonna
Magie du numérique.
Which is glorious and amazing and not a problem whatsoever. The point of this kind of earlier phase of exploration in concept is to test all of the different permutations and just like put them out on paper. We try to the best of our ability to kind of put all of the different ideas out there based on earlier direction from either design or narrative. Since I'm doing this by myself and I get to make all the decisions, I am just trying out a bunch of different ways to essentially depict this like darker idea of Katarina. I started with what is essentially her base costume with very little if any changes. And now I'm going to try to start changing up small aspects or large aspects of her design. So slightly more disheveled, a little bit more dystopian feel if we wanted to maybe interpret a darker version of Katarina as someone who has maybe lost a sense of self in her pursuit of perfection, and maybe she sort of become this, like, if an assassin could get worse, you know, maybe she's become someone that even that side of the law does not want to get involved with because she is so meticulous, so obsessive. Maybe she has less metal pieces, she has less elements to her costume that are custom crafted to fit her and the way that she moves. You know, all those little details contribute to this kind of grander idea of who this version of this character is, what they've endured, what they've surpassed, and kind of seen the other side of. I think these Legends characters try to ride the line of still being very aspirational, still being very heroic in a certain way, although clearly there are some characters that are not heroes, they're most definitely villains. And Katarina is neither hero nor, I guess, full villain. There are ways that you can make her story feel a little bit less lethal and a little bit less harsh. But the character that I want to make today, I want to see how dark Katarina could go. And so how do we change her costume to do that? Part of designing her to escape... Hello.
À
Portion designing for
99%,
2XKO
le prochain
is
perso, ça va être
also
Caitlyn, quoi.
considering
Mais...
the different material reads
Je sais que
of a
2XKO,
design.
c'est le
It's trying to
jeu
pull together that
arcane.
heritage
C'est
of
arcane le jeu, mais bon,
2D fighting games.
Bon.
This is a version of Katarina that doesn't have the leathers. She has more of this, like, maybe she has a little bit more of a cotton, scrounged together look, and it's not polished or even scrapped leather. Maybe she has less metal pieces. She has less elements to her costume that are custom crafted to fit her and the way that she moves. You know, all those little details contribute to this kind of grander idea of who this version of this character is, what they've endured, what they've surpassed, and kind of seen the other side of. I've done a couple of pretty tight-fitting versions, so I want to try other alternative ideas for where you could take a character just by changing one thing or changing an ensemble piece, like the shirt or the pants. Classically, we've been making the pants really big because that's in right now. It doesn't fit for every character, but it's worth trying. Always worth trying all these ideas. Now I have to pick. To make a decision. I always get the opportunity to offload the decision making to other people. It's just easier because other people will be like, oh, well, this doesn't feel like them, or this feels cooler, or whatever. And I'm like, great, thank you. There's almost this extra pressure of like, now account for like 20 other people's potential opinions to make the one that feels the most reasonable. Because I'm always going to pick the one that definitely doesn't work for anyone. I think we'll keep it simple. I will mix two of them together and call that the iteration. I think I'm going to mix A and B together and just try to find something in between. If we call this one A, this one B, this one C. And then we'll go on from there. The original pass that I did was kind of just trying to shoot in as many different directions as possible. It includes looking at different actual ensemble pieces, right? So like, what is she actually wearing? Is she wearing a crop jacket that's tight leather, or is she wearing something a little bit looser that has a little bit more flair? Obviously, we have her original design that I did a rendition of just to put that on the table. And then a variation of a bunch of different elements, right? What kind of hairstyle does she have, the kind of makeup that she has, and, you know, the way that she kind of, it like evokes a certain emotion or a certain kind of atmosphere. Each of these try to be somewhat unique in their own way. I'm not necessarily trying to reinvent the wheel, but more so find ways to switch up our perception of her so that if there is one that feels particularly interesting, we can actually pursue it. Trying to hone in more on that kind of darker potential version of her. I decided to go with this sort of rightmost option just because additional spikes placed in an area that had a little bit more presence, like her shoulders. Reminiscent of Ardaria's design in 2XKO, but you know, it kind of makes her feel a little bit more in line with this very sharp and jagged personality. Once we leave exploration, which usually takes a few weeks to do, and I will have done probably about 5 times the amount of art that I've done today, then we will hone in on something that feels like it has potential. Once we find maybe a couple of designs that do that, or one design that feels the strongest, we'll go into what we call iteration. So this is a really pared down version of iteration where we essentially take the main idea and just try to extrapolate other potential directions from there, whether or not those are small details, whether or not those are big changes as well. It really is all in service of just testing the waters for what is possible and what feels right. And then the final one was sort of just like a last bid to see, like, could I put her in almost a sort of vampire hunter-esque thing, make her feel a little bit more of like the villain in the dark sort of a vibe, going full mask, even though Katarina doesn't seem to be shy about hiding her face in any way, just to see if you know, the changes that we make to the characterization of her would change that part of her character as well. And I think at the end, I still really like A and B's version, but I do want to do something that kind of mixes the two of them for something that feels just like this is Katarina in a pursuit of madness into some form of emotional descent. without completely stripping away any of her inherent, you know, charisma, any of her inherent, like, poise, right? Ultimately, Katarina is still meant to feel heroic, still meant to feel aspirational. But I think we can make small edits here, combine the two, and just find something that feels a little bit of both. Concept art doesn't typically, and especially on 2XKO, we don't typically do final full pieces for our concepts. It is good enough for a character artist to take and keep moving, which makes me happy because finishing art is difficult and takes a lot of time, and it doesn't add a lot of value for concept specifically. So I'm going to try to take it to as close of a finish as we need it to be for a modeler to take and get a better idea of what she might look like in 2XKO. The long hair is sort of problematic only because the pursuit of trying to keep limbs and extremities separate means that anything that sits too close to kind of like where the joint is for something, for a different element or piece, could interfere with that from a like technical standpoint. So long hair that sits right against the nape and there's a lot of mass there can be kind of problematic. That's why, you know, Ari has like this, you know, condensed braid, which can move as one unit and doesn't require a ton of extra individual parts. That's why when we do collars, we try to like keep it away from the neck so that when there's any kind of dramatic animation that requires some head movement, you're not going to risk doing something that's a little tricky or a little delicate when it comes to how that part of the body interacts with the costuming or any other feature. But
ça marche sur le concept
since
de
I
base.
am not handing this
Et quand
off
tu fais des
to
skins, ça ne
someone,
marche
we're
plus du tout.
gonna do what we sort of want. I will probably make the hair sit somewhat in like a bit of a kind of like a ponytail that sits a little bit away from the neck. I think for a character like our current Power Hour version of Katarina, it works to kind of make her feel a little unfriendly. It works to kind of add a very obvious visual hook to describe this version's temperament and maybe friendliness. But on top of that, also adds a very easy way to create kind of a dramatic silhouette up by the shoulders, because, you know, a lot of Noxus metals are silver, so it's going to be this really nice bright focal point right by what could be a darker jacket or her darker hair, and while we don't want to completely overwhelm that area with metal and silver, it's a nice opportunity to introduce a different tone. It's a nice excuse to create some pretty interesting shoulder shapes, which allow us to then maybe even consider simplifying her arms so that that upper shoulder portion is more interesting, and then her hands can be more interesting. The, you know, desire to add too much detail to the kind of length of the arm, we save that for precious real estate elsewhere. That's kind of the push and pull relationship of designing a costume for a character, is recognizing what about them feels like a more important focal point than other places, and kind of adjusting all of the surrounding elements to make that feel appropriately eye-catching. I think the toughest question I've had to ask myself, and a question that I think all creatives should at some point ask themselves, is whether or not you're actually curious about the world around you. I realized early on when I was getting into character design that I really wasn't a very curious person, much less a curious artist. And it made the work that I did very insular. Dare I say, aesthetically incestuous, right? It's derivatives of derivatives. And it's so easy to do that when you know what you love, you know what you respond to, you just want to make the stuff that you love and want to see out in the world. But the reality is that as designers, we are the arbiters of not just our taste, but everyone's taste. Everyone from leadership to, you know, our coworkers on our team, to the audience, to the players. And when we are incurious about the kind of content that's out there, the kind of art that's out there, how we can expand our craft, not just through being better artists, but also just being better people. I think when we don't do that, we
tu vas proposer tes designs qui te semblent bons pour toi.
to
quand tu vas voir
kind of
le
just
lead, il va te dire
alleviate
bah
that
non, du coup,
responsibility from ourselves.
ça marche
I
pas.
realized how much more there was to engage with, how much
Et il faut
more there
surtout pas
was
se
to
renfermer en mode
design
oh, je suis
in
frustré, il
general.
a pas aimé
It evolved
il a
into
pas aimé mon
really
dessin.
analyzing and questioning myself
Non, faut
about
juste
like,
que tu sois
was
plus
I
curieux.
actually interested in costume design, or was I interested in costume design when it confirmed my own taste? And that lack of curiosity was what led to me realizing
Parce qu'il y a des gens
that
qui
none of my
juste
designs felt
non mais si je suis curieux, je vais
interesting
scroller
enough. None of
pendant
them
2 heures
felt
sur
like
Pinterest.
I loved them
Et
enough
c'est pas ça le truc.
to give them a fighting chance.
C'est
And so if there's
faut
anything I would love for
vraiment
all
explorer
artists to
différents
do is
styles,
to ask
différents
yourself
trucs.
whether or not you are curious about the world around you, curious about
Et
the
ensuite
other
tu fais ton
artists
mood
that
board
are
si tu veux
living
sur
now
Pinterest.
or living before, and all the
Pas
different
chercher un truc
kinds of
précis
ways
et avoir
design
des
can
itérations de ce
manifest
truc.
itself in other disciplines. Because I think once
Sinon
you
ça
really
marche pas.
open your eyes to that, this world of character design can be so much more exciting than it already is. This aspect and element of art can have, you know, sort of this
Stylé,
open
c'est
blue
cinématique, hein,
sky
vraiment.
of opportunity. It's hard to recognize that you're missing out on that when
J'avais pas reconnu
you
Katarina au
willingly
début.
put yourself in a box
Seulement après avec
because
les
it
lames,
feels safe.
j'ai fait
So
ah oui, si, c'est elle.
challenge your ideas, challenge your aesthetics, challenge your tastes. When you find things that you don't like or kind of are repulsed by, it's a perfect opportunity to understand why, to expand your horizons, to encompass things that you love and you don't. Being curious, I think, is the mark of a real, true designer, a real, true artist. Because it's only once you do that that you fully understand what is possible and what has not yet been done, and can therefore do something meaningful about that. The nice thing about Clip Studio is setting up a layer which you can reference, so tools will then use that layer to calculate what it wants to do versus whatever you have on the layer currently on. And in kind of concert with this tool, I can be absolved of my crimes for not ever having clean, perfectly closed line art,
oui.
and I can still quickly color my work. There's nothing I hate more than coloring a concept. However, it is so helpful when selling an idea that I usually force myself to do it. Thankfully, Clip makes it much less painless, or it's much more painless to do it in Clip Studio than really any other program. So this is really when the concept will feel finished for a lot of people, because once you see it with color, you see it with values, you start to understand like how certain things get pushed back into the frame, back into space, because you start to appreciate all of the hard lifting that color and value are doing for you subconsciously. It really is kind of this collaborative effort, even between all of the different elements of the concept, to make what feels like a solid final design. It's always very cool when someone's wearing red gloves, and originally my thought was, oh, she'll have the red gloves so it's super bright against both her skin and then the swords. The issue is that she has a lot of red hair, which will probably get in the way or be behind her hands. And now you have this issue of, you could either make the hair darker and just hope that a lighter red stands out against a darker red, or make the decision to change one or the other. There are ways to work around stuff like that, but that's why it's always good to see things in concert with each other, to have a pose where things are sort of overlapping, because it's really in the overlap of limbs that you get the most amount of risk. That's where the most amount of noise will appear, because you're contending with a character who's constantly moving and shifting around, and if too much of their color palette is easily overlappable with itself, then the character is nigh impossible to see when in motion, much less, you know, flat on this kind of concepting page. Try to keep that in mind, you know, what issues visually might pop up if we make certain decisions. What I'll probably have to do is I can either do a two-toned glove, where it's dark on one side, light on the other, or be cool with neither. Which I can also be behind if color blocking works out, but if I do a darker color, then you have her pants to figure out. Maybe I make the pants a slightly different color. Maybe I make them kind of like a very dull camo green instead, just to see if maybe that feels distinct enough to kind of give us some leeway with the gloves. Which is not a bad look, but red and green is hard to sell because it immediately looks like Christmas. But, you know, again, all of this in service of giving us some leeway with this very particular part of her design. Because red gloves are nice. It'd be really cool to do them. They're always cool when you see them in a piece of media, but might not be the perfect time for a decision like that. Something that was impressed upon me when I was a student was very much this feeling of design is such a separate thing from a lot of other forms of art. And I don't think I would have actually been very good at concept art if I hadn't been forced to reckon with the fact that, like, the act of designing something and the act of designing a character is not the same as drawing, you know, a beautiful picture of some nice looking character. It's very fun to design characters for yourself and in your free time, but it really wasn't until I had, you know, design teachers in my life kind of really sit me down and say, it's good that you're good at art to some extent, but it's not good enough for what design demands of you. It just reformatted my brain for what I should actually be taking very seriously. I think in a way the best advice was, it wasn't even like a phrase or words, but a sentiment that you can't assume that there's going to be kind of like an ease into the transition of between different skills. Like, that there's something very particular and special about every niche, every industry, every type of project that you work on. So I, moving forward, never assumed that I could understand how to design for both a MOBA and a fighting game and an MMO and like a beat 'em up or something like that. I couldn't assume to know how to design for all those things, and that I had to be curious about what demands they had based on their genre, based on the kind of gameplay that they wanted a player to engage with, and that was integral to the process of designing a character. Unless someone had told me that, I don't think I would have naturally understood that there's so much nuance to each particular niche, each particular kind of project, and how different design is as like a way of thinking, as a way of seeing the world. In a way, it was heartbreaking, I think, because it meant that a lot of the ways that I had thought about art, a lot of the ways that I enjoyed art, were not suited for this thing that I wanted to do. But then the more I thought about it, the more I realized it was actually really exciting to know that there's no end to the problems you have to solve doing this job, working in this industry, that to be on a project in which you are confronted with problems you've never had to solve before is actually quite exciting. It's that sentiment of you aren't ever fully prepared, that you have to always be curious, because being confident about your abilities purely due to lack of challenge or lack of or kind of an overwhelming amount of ignorance towards this field, something which becomes extremely obvious very quickly when you start to have conversations with other people actively working in game development, or, you know, very familiar with a type of project or a type of game, and you realize like all of their priorities are different, all of their sentiment and their focus is all over the place. And just because you like designing characters doesn't necessarily mean you know how to design the best character that they need or they want. Which, again, devastating, and then it eventually became really exciting to know that character design isn't just how do you make a cool looking character, but rather, you know, how do you come up with the best solution given very particular sets of parameters. And that's design. That's what it actually is. Which is great because it's essentially this ongoing complex puzzle where it never ends and there's never the perfect logical answer for you to get to the same, you know, set of patterns or set of, you know, solutions, because it's so specific and it's so unique that I might never fully understand the scope of how characters are designed because there's just so many different projects to design for. And in general, I think that just opened my mind to just being excited to learn about how different games and different projects are made. I have a newfound appreciation for people who can context switch, who can bring a sense of familiarity to like all of their different projects because they just have that flexibility. It's something I, you know, sort of endeavor to try to do every time is exercise a level of flexibility that allows me to solve a wider variety of problems. And I think if that's stuff that you're interested in, like, character design is a really fun way to do it, you know? I think there's a lot of different roles that you could look into that would give you a similar experience, but if you're an artist and you like solving problems, there is no end to all the problems that you'll have working in games. But at the same time, it's also really, really cool to get to kind of come together with a whole group of people and taking all of their expertise to inform something that, you know, to some people should be intuitive. Just make the cool character that everyone's going to want to, you know, buy and pay for, but it's more than that, and it's great that it's more than that, because then that means there's sort of an endless amount of things to learn and to keep improving on. I think that sentiment, that like,
même si
I don't know, curse of a never-ending journey that my teacher sort of gave me was enlightening, because it became obvious that it wasn't enough to be a good artist, which is great. The ceiling is even higher than it was before. So if you have that sense of curiosity, it's getting to see a whole new sky like open up in front of you, which is at least how I interpreted it, because, you know, it's easy to be overwhelmed by that notion, but I think once you come to terms with how you want to enjoy the work that you make and how you want to interact with it, I personally found it to be very exciting that there are different puzzles that can be found in all these different places, but you can find them all within working in games. I consider myself very fortunate to have been able to find a place working in games, because there's no end to all the fun puzzles that I get to work on. Typically, concepts live and die off of being useful, so typically we don't get to finish a lot of our stuff in any way. But for the sake of, you know, not really having too much extra fancy stuff to show for the concept process in this sort of very truncated form, we could all just add some vague, spooky shapes just to tie it all together. Okay, yeah, I think we're done. Yay!
Ben, GG, c'est... Attends, hop, je vais juste mettre là. Voilà.
So to recap today, we went in with Katarina. We did some research on who she is and the proper, while also doing a little bit of exploratory research and reference to build what could possibly be a version of Katarina visually. We then went into a bit of an ideation phase, exploration,
même d'autres jeux, en vrai.
What changes can we make to Katarina to really push
franchement, c'est vachement
this new
cool.
idea for her, this darker
C'est grave stylé. Bon, du coup, on sait que le perso arrive, mais pas tout de suite.
which one felt the strongest out
Mais
of the group, and then went
en tout
into
cas,
kind of an iteration phase
hâte d'avoir un fan assassin.
some details,
J'ai envie de voir Akali
what they added or
plus que
detracted
Katarina,
from that
mais...
very end, we decided on a design, and
Mais
then
Katarina est
brought
quand même
that to
sacrément badass.
essentially a form of finish that I would typically do for
Et justement, le
a
fait qu'ils aient
concept
designé le
context game.
perso
Ever since Katarina
pour être un
was
jeu en
around,
1v1,
the project,
puis ensuite ils sont passés au DVD, ils ont fait non, on laisse de côté, on va se concentrer sur d'autres persos parce que son build ne fonctionne pas. Prenez des bonnes idées, hein. Prenez juste des bonnes idées et peut-être qu'à un moment, on se rendra compte que le jeu peut se jouer avec juggernaut, avec certains persos, au niveau. En tout cas, c'est grave stylé. Grave stylé. Oh.